The rain fell in sheets across the ancient forest of Zephyr, where 300-year-old trees stood like monuments to a world that had forgotten mercy. Dr. James Hartwell was 63 years old, and he had spent the last decade of his life studying the ecosystem of this distant planet, Sci-Fi. He never expected to find a reason to risk everything. James moved carefully through the undergrowth, his weathered face lined with 60 years of experiences, both joyful and painful. His research station was only 2 kilometers away, but in these woods, distance meant nothing. Time meant everything. He had come out despite the warnings from the station commander, driven by an impulse that he could not fully explain. In all his years as a scientist, James had learned to trust his instincts. That was when he heard the sound, not the call of native creatures, which he had learned to recognize. This was something different. This was the sound of fear, raw and pure, cutting through the storm like a blade. James quickened his pace, moving toward the sound despite the danger. His knees protested the movement, reminding him that he was no longer a young man. At 63, his body did not move with the speed it once had. Yet his mind remained sharp, and his heart still carried the weight of every choice he had ever made. Through a break in the ancient trees, he saw her. She sat huddled at the base of an enormous trunk, her blue skin barely visible against the dark moss. She could not have been more than 16 years old, her delicate features twisted in an expression of terror that transcended species and language. Her eyes were fixed upward, watching the circle of enormous creatures that surrounded her. James had seen recordings of the Skarath creatures. Every researcher on Sci-Fi knew their reputation. They were predators, apex hunters that could tear through reinforced metal with their claws. There were 5 of them now, moving slowly toward the girl, testing her, enjoying the moment before the kill. Their spikes bristled along their massive shoulders, and their eyes glowed with the hunger of creatures that had not eaten in days. The girl saw James at that moment. Her eyes widened, and for a second, hope flickered across her young face. Then it faded, replaced by shame. She turned away from him, as if to protect him from what was about to happen. James understood in that moment that this girl was not thinking about her own survival. She was thinking about his. James had made many choices in his life. He had chosen science over family in his younger years, a decision he had spent decades regretting. He had chosen safety over principle when a mining colony had requested his help against environmental concerns, a choice that had haunted his sleep for 3 years. He had chosen his career, his reputation, his comfortable life, over and over again. And standing here now, watching a young girl prepared to die alone, James Hartwell finally made a choice that felt true. He stepped forward into the clearing. The Skarath creatures turned toward him as one. Their movements were fluid and terrible, muscles rippling beneath skin that seemed to shimmer in the gray light. The largest one snarled, a sound that seemed to emerge from deep within the earth itself. James could feel the weight of their attention on him, could sense their confusion at his presence. To them, he was another meal, but an unexpected one. An old meal, perhaps, but fresh. James raised his hand slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. He had learned through decades of life that panic was a choice. Fear was a choice. But grace, true grace in the face of the inevitable, that required something deeper than instinct. "I am not here to harm you," James said, his voice steady despite the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. "I am just an old man. But that young girl over there, she deserves a chance to live." The creatures did not understand his words. The Skarath did not possess human language. Yet something in his tone, something in the way he stood, seemed to register with them. The largest creature tilted its massive head, studying him with those terrible golden eyes. James took a step to the side, moving between the predators and the girl. His hands remained open, non-threatening, but his posture was unmistakable. He was making a choice. He was drawing their attention away from the defenseless girl and toward himself. Behind him, he heard a small sound escape from the girl. It might have been a sob. It might have been a prayer in whatever language her kind spoke. The seconds that followed seemed to stretch into hours. The largest Skarath took a step forward, its claws scraping against stone. The sound was like the end of the world, or perhaps the beginning. James felt a calm settle over him that was almost surprising in its clarity. He thought of his daughter, who had stopped speaking to him when he chose his research posting over attending her wedding. He thought of the first time he had seen Earth's sun rise over an ocean, and how he had taken that beauty for granted until he was old enough to understand what beauty truly meant. He thought of every moment he had lived, and he felt something like completion. Then the creature stopped. It was an impossible moment. The Skarath froze, its body tense with predatory purpose, yet something stayed its attack. The creature made a low sound, almost like a rumble of consideration. Around it, the other 4 creatures mirrored its pause. James did not move. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply stand firm in their conviction. He had stood firm in his beliefs many times, though he had not always stood firm in his choices. Perhaps, he thought, perhaps this was his chance to make those 2 things finally align. The largest creature took another step forward, and James braced himself. But instead of striking, the Skarath seemed to smell him, to test the air around his body. It made another sound, different from the first, almost questioning. When it spoke, the translation device in James's gear struggled to make sense of the sounds, but the meaning came through clear enough. Your species. Old. Alone. Why? James realized in that moment that the creatures possessed intelligence far beyond what his colleagues had assumed. They were not mindless killers. They were beings capable of curiosity, capable of wondering why an old human would stand between them and a potential meal. Because, James said slowly, choosing his words with great care, life is precious. All life. And I have lived long enough to know that the measure of a being, any being, is not what they eat or what they kill. It is what they choose to protect. The creatures did not respond immediately. Instead, they seemed to be communicating among themselves in low rumbling sounds that James's translator could not quite capture. He stood motionless, allowing them whatever time they needed to make their decision. When the largest creature finally moved, it was backward. The 4 others followed, their massive bodies moving with surprising grace away from the girl. They did not rush. They did not flee in panic. They simply withdrew, as if they had lost interest in their prey. As if they had heard something in James's words that resonated with whatever version of conscience existed in their minds. Within moments, the creatures had disappeared back into the forest, leaving behind only the sound of rain and the hammering of James's own heart. He stayed in that clearing for a long moment, allowing his body to process what had just happened. His legs felt weak. His hands were shaking. All the reality of his age and fragility seemed to crash down on him at once. He was 63 years old, and he had just faced down 5 apex predators with nothing but words and conviction. He turned to look at the girl. She was standing now, her blue skin seeming to glow in the gray light. She was taller than he had realized, perhaps close to his own height now that she stood on her feet. But her eyes were still young, still holding that mixture of fear and wonder that came from surviving something that should have killed her. "What is your name?" James asked gently. "Seraphina," the girl replied, her voice like wind chimes in a breeze. "I am Seraphina of the Theshan people. I have been lost in these woods for 3 days." The Skarath found my trail yesterday. They have been hunting me since dawn. James nodded slowly. He understood now why the Skarath had let her live. They had been hunting her, yes, but they were not mindless about it. When he had placed himself between them and their target, he had presented them with a choice. Stand firm in their predatory nature, or step back and acknowledge something larger than instinct. Come, James said, extending his hand toward her. My station is not far. We can get you somewhere warm and dry. We can figure out how to get you home. Serafina looked at his hand for a moment, then at his face. She seemed to be searching for something in his features, perhaps trying to understand why an old man would risk his life for a stranger. Why did you do this? She asked. You do not know me. I am not of your kind. James smiled, and in that smile was the weight of 63 years of learning what it meant to be human, to be conscious, to be capable of choosing compassion over self-preservation. I did it because I have lived long enough to know that kindness is not a luxury. It is the only thing that separates us from the beasts. And I have not always remembered that. I thought if I could remember it now, if I could live that principle just once with complete clarity, then perhaps my life would have meant something after all. Serafina took his hand. Her grip was warm despite the cold rain. As they walked together through the ancient forest toward his station, James felt something shift inside him. It was not peace, exactly. It was something deeper. It was the sense that he had finally, after all these years, done something that aligned with who he had always wanted to be. The rain continued to fall around them, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like a benediction, like the forest itself was washing away the old choices and offering something new. When they reached the station 3 hours later, the commander was shocked to see James return with a Theshan girl in tow. But when James explained what had happened, the other researchers seemed to understand that something significant had occurred in those woods. Something that went beyond the normal parameters of survival and predation. Over the following weeks, Serafina recovered from her ordeal. She shared information about her people that contradicted every assumption the research team had made. The Theshans were not the hostile species that the galactic database had suggested. They were peace builders, travelers, explorers of other worlds. Serafina had only been lost because her exploration pod had malfunctioned, leaving her stranded on Thesera 5 with no way to contact her people. James worked tirelessly to help her repair her communication device. And when the Theshan rescue ship arrived in orbit 3 months later, Serafina stood with him on the observation deck, watching her people's vessel take shape against the stars. I will not forget what you did, Serafina said to him. In my culture, we have a concept called the debt of stars. When someone saves your life, they are connected to your soul forever. My people will know of you, James Hartwell. And one day, if your species needs help, we will remember. James looked at this girl, now a young woman, who had taught him more about being human than he had learned in all his years of study. The only payment I need, he said, is knowing that you will tell your people about the Skarath creatures. Tell them that they are not mindless killers. Tell them that when given the choice, even the most fearsome creatures can choose compassion. Tell them that perhaps there is more common ground between our species than we ever imagined. Serafina nodded solemnly. She embraced him then, not as a grateful refugee embracing a rescuer, but as one intelligent being embracing another. In that moment, James felt the weight of his years lift slightly. He had made a choice that felt true. As he watched Serafina's vessel lift off and disappear into the vast expanse of space, James Hartwell returned to his research with renewed purpose. His report on Thesera 5's ecosystem was comprehensive and thorough, but his personal notes contained something more. He documented the intelligence of the Skarath creatures. He wrote about the possibility that beneath every creature's predatory nature lay the capacity for choice, for consideration, for mercy. That report would take 3 years to reach the Galactic Research Council. When it did, it would change the way several species approached contact with apex predators across dozens of worlds. It would establish new protocols for peaceful encounter. And it would all trace back to one old man's choice to stand between a girl and the darkness. James continued his work on Sci-Fi for another 5 years before he finally retired. By then, he had made peace with many of his earlier choices. He had reconnected with his daughter, had attended her son's graduation, had learned that forgiveness, like compassion, could arrive at any age if someone was patient enough to wait for it. The last report he filed before leaving Sci-Fi contained a simple addendum. In my years of studying this remarkable planet, I have learned that science can measure and quantify the natural world. But it cannot quantify the moment when one being chooses to see another not as a threat or an opportunity, but as a companion on the journey through consciousness. That moment, I believe, is where true understanding begins. Years later, long after James Hartwell had passed away, his work would be referenced in countless academic papers. But more importantly, it would be remembered in the oral traditions of both the Skarath creatures and the Theshan people, passed down as a story of the old human who had taught them all that choice matters. That standing firm in our principles, even at great personal risk, can ripple across worlds and change the trajectory of history. This is a story about what happens when we choose to see the light in another being, even when that being appears to embody darkness. It is a story about the power of a single action taken by a single person with complete conviction and compassion. It is a story that reminds us that we are never too old to change the course of history. We are never too old to matter. We are never too old to make a choice that will echo across the stars. If this story resonated with you, if it touched something deep within your memory of who you are and who you want to be, then I ask you to do 3 things. First, please like this story. Second, share it with someone who has taught you about the power of compassion. And third, subscribe to hear more tales of science fiction that honor the wisdom that comes with age and experience. In the comments below, I would love to hear from you. Tell me about a moment when you chose compassion over convenience. Tell me about a choice that changed your life. Let us build a community where the stories of our lived experience matter, where the wisdom of age is valued, and where the possibility of connection across all boundaries remains eternally alive. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being part of this story.